Ben Wikler, chief of the Wisconsin Democratic Party. We've got this recent Supreme Court election. Finally, have a liberal majority on the state Supreme Court that has put in question the 10-year gerrymander that basically keeps Republicans holding a not just super majorities in the state legislature, not just majorities. Our readers and listeners know a lot about this. State Republicans have been making these threats about impeaching Janet Protasiewicz even before she's made any rulings. And then last week they came out with this, what seemed to me like a show of weakness, basically saying, well, okay, maybe we'll just do at least what they say is nonpartisan, nonpartisan process. Did you interpret it the same way? Like maybe they don't really think they can impeach her? What's your understanding of where this is?
I think Wisconsin Republicans, especially in the legislature, are now panicked because they kicked what they thought was going to be a snowman, and it turns out to be a hornet's nest. They thought they could just push us over and run an impeachment with a simple majority of a legislature in which they have 64 out of the 99 seats. And there were rumors circulating they were going to run the impeachment vote last Tuesday, but instead, basically a week before that, because the word had gotten out, Democrats and pro-democracy groups launched a huge counteroffensive and started putting a spotlight on this totally unconstitutional attempt to nullify the last election and effectively abolish judicial independence in Wisconsin. And the public outcry was so big that I think the many Republicans who are thinking beyond the immediate moment realized that this could spell disaster for the GOP for their national convention. When there's going to be huge national spotlight on our state, they need to raise tens of millions of dollars, probably from a lot of corporate interests that don't like, abolishing the judicial system. They need to win Wisconsin to win the presidential election. And if this is a kind of backlash election against the reversal of a statewide landslide victory, that's bad news for them. And the whole thing could fail even if they do impeach Janet Protasiewicz. So if they walk off the plank, casting this vote to impeach a Supreme Court justice, they get new maps anyway, and suddenly they're running in actually 50-50 districts facing an electorate who they just punched in the face. What do they think is going to happen? So we're seeing Republicans, hearing rumors of Republicans privately having huge arguments about this, and the state legislature, Robin Vos, the Republican Assembly Speaker, did this kind of panic Hail Mary move to play for time. He tried to change the subject, which is always what people do when their argument is not working. And he introduced this sham nonpartisan redistricting bill that was written in the middle of the night, introduced with no consultation with the state Senate, from anything we can tell. He did not inform the Democratic caucus that this is something he was planning, even though when he presented it, he made it sound like this was his grand compromise bargain with Democrats. It was a stunt. And it's a stunt intended to give political cover to the moderates in his delegation, which is something you do when you know that you're taking on water very quickly. So I think the key thing for the public is to keep the pressure on impeachment and make them take the gun off the table.
So I've heard what you just said, but walk me through the mechanics of this, because from outside the state, they were threatening to impeach your Democratic governor after he was elected. I mean, when you have super majorities that seem ironclad. I mean, just for our listeners outside the state, our viewers outside the state, the only real question in Wisconsin over the last decade is whether legislative Republicans get the majority or the super majority. There's like no way for them to lose that. So why don't they look at this and say, okay, maybe there's a public backlash, but like, we own the state, and so why do we care? I get what you're saying about the national convention is going to be there, and that's bad publicity. But can you give us a little more? They seem so invulnerable. Give us more of a sense of why they seem to be kind of going wobbly here.
So there's a few pieces of this puzzle. One of them is there's a very deeply internalized story about what happened when Scott Walker was governor. Scott Walker passed Act 10. There was a kind of similar shock and awe blitz by the GOP. There was a big public backlash. And then there was a recall effort to try to remove Scott Walker. And Republicans feel that by trying to recall Scott Walker, they made him stronger. So the recall failed, and then he was reelected in a landslide. And I think Republicans, some of the conversation is that this is their recall, that if they try to overturn a Supreme Court election, they will help guarantee Democratic victories in a slew of offices, including the Supreme Court. If they impeached and removed Janet Protasiewicz, there would be a new Supreme Court election this coming April. So they could face a backlash immediately. If they impeach and suspend, then this would be the central topic in Wisconsin politics until such time as something changes. Now they will, if they did this, I'm sure that it would wind up in court, and their legal argument's pretty weak. In the Wisconsin Constitution, it says you need to have corrupt conduct in office, crimes, or misdemeanors. And what is eminently clear is that Janet Protasiewicz can decide for herself, based on Wisconsin's rules, whether to recuse. And if she did not recuse, it would be completely in line with both the rules and the practices established by conservative justices in the state. And if you're doing something that follows all the rules, you can't really be conducting corrupt conduct in office that warrants impeachment. There's never been an impeachment and removal in our state. There was one impeachment and acquittal in 1853 for a justice who was taking bribes in office and then giving inside information to litigants in the case. So that is actual corrupt conduct in office.
Right.
This is crossing a line that is so novel that I think there's a sense, this has never happened, as far as we can tell, anywhere in the country, that a judge has been impeached to prevent them from ruling on something that might hurt the legislature, the biggest conflict of interest in the world. And there's a sense that this may be a line too far. The other kind of more crassly political piece of this is that Janet Protasiewicz won by 11 percentage points, massive landslide, despite the
Wisconsin, every election is like a 50. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So she won enough state Senate districts, that even if the current maps were in place, if all the Senate districts that went for Janet voted against their current incumbent Republican senator, Democrats would get the majority. And in the state assembly, she won 12 assembly seats. So they would almost eliminate the majority Republicans have in the state assembly. All of that presuming that this actually worked and stopped new maps from happening in 2024, which again is not at all a foregone conclusion. And if a court knocked this out, then Republicans would have blown up the world with their vote very visibly, and then a judicial process leads to fair maps, conceivably, and suddenly they have the worst of all possible worlds. And I think that's the calculus that they have to face at this moment.
Now, how much there was I guess, an independent body that reviews complaints about Supreme Court justices. They came back, I believe it was last week, maybe 10 days ago, basically saying, yeah, we've looked at these complaints. We don't think they have any merit. Was that a significant factor in Republicans thinking, all right, we just have nothing to stand on here? If that has that played into this, or is that kind of neither here nor there?
So the Judicial Commission is an independent body. Republicans had filed complaints during the campaign about Janet Protasiewicz's comments on the campaign. Just as conservatives have run as conservatives over and over in these elections, Justice Protasiewicz talked about her personal political beliefs during her campaign, which is, according to the U.S. Supreme Court opinion by Scalia, is protected speech for judicial candidates. But Republicans filed a complaint. That complaint was dismissed. The letter dismissing it was made public by Justice Protasiewicz a couple weeks ago, and she asked Republicans have sued to try to get her to recuse herself. She asked the Republicans and the people litigating the MAPS case, who have urged her not to recuse herself, to respond to the dismissal of the complaints. I think it buttresses her argument that her behavior is totally within bounds, which is kind of plainly true. I'm not sure whether that. I'm sure that was one kind of piece on the balance scale for Robin Vos, but none of what he's doing has anything to do with the law or the Constitution or corruption. It is pure power politics. It's a goal of making, having a kind of one branch of government to rule them all system in Wisconsin, instead of having three co-equal branches of government. And that's lines up with everything he's ever done. But this is really jumping two bridges too far in terms of how profound the power grab would be if he did it.
So last question. So they came out with this, kind of purported compromise last week that was on its face supposed to be like a we're going to have nonpartisan staffers making the maps and everything. And there's various reasons that people can look up why it wasn't necessarily what it looked like. But what are you as the Democratic Party of Wisconsin going to do next? And I guess even more than that, what do you expect them to do next? I mean, the Governor Evers basically said, no way, we're not doing anything like that. So I would assume they either now have to impeach her, since that's their threat, or if they don't, their hand has been called. So what's the next step here? What do we
They have,
see happening over the
yeah.
next few weeks?
So on Tuesday, Robin Voss announces this kind of sham legislation. On Wednesday, he announces that he's appointing a secret panel of former Supreme Court justices to advise him on the process and merits of impeachment. So this is very much a uh, pass this bill or I shoot this kid kind of hostage situation that he's trying
Right.
to create. But it also creates a potential off ramp for him. So the people he's appointed, one of them is a public name, David Prosser, former Republican Supreme or conservative Supreme Court justice who donated to Janet Protasiewicz's opponent, who was before that a Republican lawmaker who didn't recuse himself when he was considering the constitutionality of the laws that he passed, who famously choked a colleague during a dispute about Act 10. There are videos of him physically menacing people.
Yeah.
Anyway, but Robin Voss essentially has a path now where he could instruct his advisory panel to tell him that Justice Protasiewicz's actions don't meet the constitutional bar for impeachment, and then he could have a kind of a way of walking away from this, pretending to look like a constitutional scholar and patriot.
Right.
Um, or he could tell them, to tell him that he should impeach the new Supreme Court justice for doing the same kinds of things that his advisory panel did. And then he goes forward. And I think that the kind of intensity of pressure and focus on this during the next few weeks will shape which direction he goes. If this feels like a dead letter within Republican circles, like a kind of stunt that they tried to do that backfired, and they want to get away from it as fast as possible, then he will withdraw the threat, probably in his preference, as quietly as possible, change the subject, do some other kind of attack or whatever it is. And they have lots of things that they're doing to try to screw things up. One ominous thing they have a constitutional amendment to require a 2/3 supermajority of both chambers of the state legislature to raise taxes. And in Wisconsin, a constitutional amendment has to pass 2 successive sessions of the state legislature and then be voted on by the public. So if he can keep his maps intact, he could potentially straitjacket all future governments of Wisconsin. And there's a bunch of moves he's trying to do.
Right.
But I think he can exit stage left just by pointing to the constitutional standard, and he's been very careful to never claim affirmatively that a non-recusal would violate that constitutional standard. If you look at his public comments, he went on a right-wing talk radio show. A lawyer host said, "Do you really think this meets the constitutional standard?" And he's like, "Well, I'm no lawyer. You're the lawyer, but this is something we'll have to do an investigation on and look at." So the door's open for him. I think for us as Democrats, for anyone who cares about our Constitution, not overturning elections, not opening a Pandora's box, which, just as an aside, if they can impeach someone successfully to stop them from ruling in a way they don't like, what'll they do after the 2024 election? I mean, it was one vote in our state Supreme Court that prevented the 2020 election from being overturned in Wisconsin. And they know who the justices were, so they could just suspend them.
Right.
This would open the door to monsters that I don't think that they'd be able to control if they do this. So our job is to make this so politically unpalatable that they decide, to actually read the Constitution and back off the threat. What we cannot do is let them change the subject to a bad faith negotiation over a sham bill that would give them kind of breathing room to pull off some kind of move. And that's the big picture here. The public needs to stay focused. Wisconsinites should contact their legislators. Every time a journalist calls a Republican legislator's office to ask them about their position, the speaker's office gets alerted to it and they cower a little bit more. Like, the public scrutiny on this, it's the best disinfectant, and we need as much of that sunlight as possible.
Got it. Ben Wikler, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Josh.